Hello, welcome everyone to our webinar on expanding into the US, what every business should know. My name is Helen and I'm the tax practice leader in our corporate tax team at LegalVision. I also have here Stephen Drysdale, our practice leader in our contract and commercial team at LegalVision and also a qualified US attorney. I also like to welcome Jason Atkins, co-founder and president of Cake Equity, a cap table and equity management platform. Welcome to both of you guys here. It's great to have you both here with me. Now, before we begin, a couple of quick housekeeping items before we begin. You'll receive the recording and slides of this presentation in your email. You can also submit your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll see on the screen in front of you, and we'll answer them at the end. And you can also complete a feedback survey, which you'll receive after the webinar. For the next 48 hours, you're eligible for a free consultation with LegalVision to discuss how we can help you with your business. You'll receive the contact details at the end, and if you provide your contact details in the survey at the end, we'll be able to contact you. Now we've got here, as you can see, the agenda for today. I'll quickly just run through the topics that we'll be covering in this presentation. The first part is, the reason for why we're expanding into the US. So we'll have the opportunity to speak to Stephen and Jason about this. Business structuring options when you're moving into the US and what those look like. The various tax considerations that you need to think about when moving to the US. The legal and regulatory environment when moving into the US from Australia. And then also thinking about the practicalities of hiring locally, or do you need to relocate to the US? And at the end, we'll just have some key takeaways for you, from all the things that we'll discuss this morning. So great, let's get into it. Now, one of the first things I like to think about when talking with clients that are looking to move into the US is why. Why are you wanting to move into the US? Why are you wanting to expand into the US or internationally? And the reasons that we generally see when we're talking with clients are clients have VCs or investors that are interested in investing into their particular startup, and that investor may only want to invest in a US Delaware company. Other kind of reasons that we see is, a startup is looking to join an accelerator program, or they've just been accepted into one, and the US accelerator is only accepting clients or investments into a US company. And lastly, we see a lot of people that are wanting to venture into the US market because they have a particular product, or they have a SaaS platform that they're wanting to expand into the US market because there's just a larger market than Australia. Now, Jason, what is your experience in then this, why did Cake move into the US, and how did you come to this decision?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. So, this happened in multiple stages for us. So the first time we interacted with the US, we were somewhat thrust into it. So off the back of StartMate, we were stoked to get in there, and, went really well. And we were talking to all the Aussie VCs, and thankfully, Rampersand joined that round, which was great. But we bumped into, a major US investor off the back of that. Jason Calacanis, who ended up leading our round. So it was a bit early for us, a bit earlier than we wanted to be, really interacting with the US. We weren't selling there at the time, but we had plans to be expanding to the US, within around 12 months. So it was all brought on us a bit quicker than we'd hoped. So we did all the corporate part of, moving to the US and getting the Delaware C Corp and all that before we did the go-to-market. So it was something that because the check size was large. I know you mentioned their US accelerators. I get asked about that a lot as well. I mean, I would never flip up just for an accelerator. Like, no offense to accelerators, but like, for a 25K check or whatever, like, there's absolutely no way in hell I would undertake all that risk and cost just for an accelerator. And I think we'll get into, some other strategic items, when you go into market there, are you moving there? Where are your customers? There's different things to take into account. So The first thing for us it was a big check. It was a very strategic investor, an investor that we absolutely wanted on our cap table, but they have a mandate in their fund that says we can only invest in US companies.
Mm,
And JCal's always online saying, Delaware is the gold standard. We only invest in Delaware companies. So
mm,
yeah, so we had to
yeah,
make that. We had to make that
yeah.
call, and we were happy to do it. Now the process itself was unbelievably complicated and costly. We can talk about that if you like, but that's kind of when and how
Yeah.
it all kicked off for us.
I mean, it sounds like from what you were saying, this isn't a process that you'll go down if it's not a large enough number. It really has to be, it needs to be a strategic move. It's not just a matter of, right, we've got into a accelerator program and that's it. Here's a few dollars. I mean, it's obviously a few more than that, but it needs to be a big enough strategic move to actually do this because of the amount of, I guess, cost involved.
Yeah, even
Yeah.
if we weren't thinking about expanding to the US
Mm,
and raising from US investors in the future, it would have even been a harder decision to do it, even
yeah.
for like the size of the check. We probably still would have done it because of the strategic alignment with Jake
Mm,
Allen Launch and everything he
yeah.
does. But yeah, like having an international corporate structure is a very serious consideration with
Yeah.
constant ongoing cost and distraction. So it's not
Yeah.
something you would do lightly.
Yeah. Yeah, we get this quite a lot where a lot of clients do think moving into the US or doing a flip up, as I guess the concept a lot of people know, is a very easy process. And, you've obviously been through it from a practical perspective. And I think this is really great for people that are online to be able to hear this because it is, and we'll talk about this throughout the presentation, but it is something that definitely people shouldn't take lightly. And it's not as simple as, yeah, we'll just move everyone up. It's not a problem. And we'll sign a few documents. It does take time. And I think understanding the why of why we're even doing this, what's the purpose of it, and what is the end goal of we actually want to be.
Yeah, so for me, you really have to be going to market in the US because
Mm,
US investors largely don't want to invest in companies that aren't going to market in the US.
mm,
So if you don't have that as a core component of your, say 3-year time horizon, then I would argue that it wouldn't be worthwhile, except for the most extreme circumstances, where the investor and or you know, the amount of money you're getting is really exceptional. Look,
mm.
because the time frame for us, I think we signed the term sheet in April, and it took. I don't want to hassle like Jake or the team or anything too much. But like it was hard. Like I'm a career finance professional and we have a general counsel and we're a cap table company and just the process is hard. It's long. You got
Mm,
lawyers on both sides, you got tax advisors on both sides, you've got to create a new company, run a new round, you've got to shift everybody up, you've got to shift your ESOP up if you've got one.
yeah.
There's lots of documents to be signed. And it's not just your considerations, it's the investors, they'll have their own considerations, their lawyers will have their own considerations, and US lawyers, again, I'm not here to hassle anyone,
Mm,
they're more difficult to, they just it's a more difficult legal regime in my opinion. It's more
yeah.
complicated and there's a different level of rigor, perhaps is in one way you could maybe put it, but it takes months at a minimum.
Mm.
Um, you know, so yeah.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. In our experience, we've seen um, the difficulty sometimes is actually the legals and the approvals required from your investors. For them, as you mentioned, they also need to get their consideration as well because it impacts them, their tax implications, their legal advisors that they need to get advice from. And that takes time. And if you have one investor who pushes back, you're back to square one, and you're trying to then, move this along, getting your approvals. So yeah, time is a big one. And I guess this kind of goes into the second question I wanted to touch on is, when you're looking to expand into the US, considering whether, do you use your existing Australian structure to do whatever it is, once you've established your why, can you keep your existing Australian structure to do that thing that you want to do? Or do you have to set up locally in the US? And if you have to set up in the US, what does that mean? What type of structure can you actually put in place in the US? Now, Stephen, in your experience as a US attorney, um, what are the most common structuring options that you have seen when setting up in the US?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think what I see a lot of is overcomplication of maybe what is being sort of proposed versus what is wanting to be achieved, if that makes sense. So
Mm,
I've spoken to people, and I know, you and I, Helen, have had these conversations many times where, someone might be, the way that their business is structured currently, or maybe what they're offering doesn't actually require them to kind of go into the US. There's actually no legal need or requirement to go into the US market, but that's what they think has to happen. And if they'd taken that step themselves, they would have opened themselves up to, more taxes, more costs, more complications. And so that's kind of the overall point, is what are you wanting to achieve, and are you overcomplicating the means to get there? When you
mm,
talk about, I guess, the common structuring options that I've seen in the US, I mean, there's the sort of the standard ones if you were maybe more already in the US market, or maybe that's where you're starting out, where, you're a sole trader. Maybe it's because you're the one actually providing those services. You're a lawyer, you're an accountant, you're a gardener, you're the one doing the labor, the heavy lifting, and you don't want to overcomplicate things. You don't want to have all the operational costs, and you're kind of willing to take on the risk of, personal liability and things like that. But things like, structures like sole traders, structures like partnerships, aren't really that useful for scaling. It becomes a lot harder to bring on, say, new business partners. It's a bit riskier when it comes to employees and bringing them on, especially from a personal liability standpoint, when, sole traders and partners in a partnership are usually liable, personally for those, not always, but most of the time are liable for the kind of the actions of the business. The two ones that you see mostly in the US from a corporate standpoint are your limited liability companies, so your LLCs, and then what your corporations is kind of what I guess we would call a PTY limited company in Australia. C Corps are obviously the popular choice. Delaware is just sort of where people tend to go, and have always gone, and that may stay, that may change. There's a few flutters around around that. Most of the reason, though, isn't really it's more about ease of doing business than any sort of, secret tax hack or anything like that. The reason you go for a corporation, and sort of to explain the difference, is that a corporation is basically like a company. It has stocks, or shares as we would call them. So you have shareholders, you have, directors, and you have the ability then to take on investors, issue them with stocks in exchange for money, the ability to set up ESOPs and things like that. A limited liability company, on the other hand, is sort of a hybrid between a partnership and a company. So you don't have shareholders, you have members. They hold like a membership interest in the LLC. There is a kind of a degree of limited liability, but the way they're taxed is more like a partnership than a company. So, you can flow through tax benefits and things. But most of the time, if you're thinking investment, if you're thinking ESOPs, if you're thinking just having stocks and things like that, a C Corp is usually where people will lean to on that basis. But again, there's complications, and the things that you need to sort of think about are, what are you looking for in terms of liability? What field are you in? How complex do you want your structure to be in terms of operational? If it's just you, like I said, do you need to undertake the complicated nature of actually incorporating the US? Also, can you actually service the US market from where you're currently operating? And we're going to talk about tax, I believe, sort of soon. And that's one of the key things around, even if you set up in the US, do you actually gain any benefits from a tax perspective if you're just sort of pulling the strings from Australia? And obviously what your future business goals are. So it's all in well to say, well, I think today I'll be in the US market, but once you sort of set those structures up, it becomes a lot harder to kind of, well, not impossible, but it does become a lot costly and expensive to try and revise those structures if your business changes in a way that could have foreseen, but you didn't plan for. So that's something that people should be really thinking about.
And almost everything you plan will change. I would have thought, considering trying a new market for the first time. So I don't have too much to add on this, but if you don't mind me jumping in,
yeah, go for it.
I'd say use your Australian company as long as possible. You want to get legal advice just to make sure you can, but if you can, where you can, stay with your Australian company while you're doing all your initial testing and learning. And then once you start to get, traction or success, or you start to learn a few things, then you can, maybe start to put some roots down. So yeah, C Corp, love that. I mean, if you're going, I think LLCs are somewhat common. We don't even have LLCs in Australia, but it's a bit like a sole trader,
like a partnership.
partnership kind of thing. They are common, but not in the startup space, really. Like if you want angel or VC investment, you'll need the C Corp, and that's we do see LLC switching to C Corps a bit. But yeah, I think for us, yeah, so just keep things as simple as you can in the short term, operate from Australia where you can in the short term. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And I think that's probably one of the key things we probably want to try to, I guess, reiterate throughout this presentation is if we can keep things as simple as possible, because we do get a lot of clients that come to us and say, I just want to move into the US, I want to market there, I just want to set up a US company now, when they don't realize, the cost involved, having to get advisors on the other side, compliance, regulatory, which we'll go through a bit later, but there's also the flow through of, the tax implications. Are we now dealing with a different type of tax residency? And is it possible just to use your Australian entity, like Jason was saying, as long as possible, test out the market, see if there's any, viability in the business, and being in the US before you start throwing all your resources in, and then potentially having to then unwind because it doesn't work. Um, I think in your case, Jason, where you had an investor who was, investing quite a bit of money, that is when you probably need to take serious consideration as to, do we do this? And then weigh out those pros and cons. And then obviously get advice from your accountants and your legals as to the strategies and how you achieve this.
Yeah, and then differentiating, say, between your corporate need. We had a corporate need to have a US
Mm,
company, but we didn't have an operating need to have a US company. So
mm.
there's like a range of different factors you need to consider that Stephen's highlighted that we'll continue to highlight. And it's like looking at each one of those factors independently and trying to work out, where there might be a need to really be US specific and where not.
Yeah, no, they're really, really great points. I guess this kind of ties into the next point I wanted to raise is, the tax implications. Stephen, you mentioned it, is thinking about what does it mean from a tax perspective? What are the various cross-border or even local tax considerations you need to be aware of? And I'm sure, Jason, you've had to deal with this, during this process and experience, and even ongoing, whilst you're in the US, is you need to think about Australian tax and also US tax as well. And how are you bringing money back into Australia? What does it mean for the Australian company, and what does it mean for your shareholders? And also funding. So how are we actually funding the US? So if we're not, if we don't set up a US head company, we don't have investors coming in from the US, how do we actually get money into the US to start the market? It's, a question we get a lot is moving money cross-border. There are tax considerations when you think about, which is transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is a very common concept and something we have to think about when we're moving funds back and forth. And then thinking about, when you're selling something in the US, is there any withholding taxes or sales tax in the US that you need to think about and also account for? Because you may not have thought about the tax and not thought about, from a business perspective, the cash flow. Where do you need to keep money? Who do you need to pay? Stephen, I think, you've had some experience in some of the practical tax implications that you've seen when setting up in the US.
Yeah, I guess there's two things. One is, I guess, an unfamiliarity with the complexity of the US tax system. So the navigating both federal and state tax obligations, and even in some states or some areas, you have local counties that might apply their own sort of taxes as well that you sort of have to be mindful of. So one of the things that I see quite often is you'll have conversations with people who'll say things like, oh, which state is best for tax? Is there a particular state? And like, sure, there are some states that maybe have a lower state income tax rate and different maybe tax treatments for, sales tax and things, which I'll touch on in a second. But what people then forget is it's all in well to maybe set up in a state, but then if you start doing business in other states, you kind of expose your company to the tax net of those other states anyway. It's sort of like if you're an Australian company, for example, and then you start employing people in New Zealand and you start, maybe you get an office there and you don't set up a local company, you potentially establish, that, and you kind of expose that Australian company to the New Zealand tax net, and suddenly you're having to report to the Inland Revenue Office on your sort of operations and total global income. So things like that, it's kind of a similar concept where if you start, you kind of go into the US market without a clear plan and a clear focus, you can very quickly kind of spread out quite quickly into having to manage all these different state-based obligations. I know it says it's the United States, but one thing that's sort of a key takeaway is that they're not very united in the way in which they operate and sort of flow together. I often say to clients that the EU is actually probably more harmonized than a collection, than the US itself. And so part of that issue is that if you go in, and you start hiring people all over the place, you've got someone in Colorado, someone in California, someone in New York, suddenly you might have a nexus with all those states. And what that might mean is, do you have income tax reporting obligations in all of those states? Do you have filing obligations in those states? Do you need to have a business license in those states? And then where's your liability for sales tax? And sales tax is one of the things that it's kind of like the US GST equivalent, I guess, which can be very hard to manage.
Yeah.
Very common for like sale of goods. Services themselves don't often attract sales tax, but things like software it depends. It's a state by state thing, and it's a local county thing as well sometimes. And the two ways that businesses usually get captured is that they either have a physical nexus or a physical connection with that particular state. So that's offices, employees, things like that. Or they have a economic nexus. So that's where, maybe you do a particular number of transactions in a 12-month period, or you sell over a certain amount of, sales value in a particular state in that period. And so managing that can be a nightmare. There are providers that sort of help with that. It's not something that an accountant in, your local US city is probably going to be able to help you manage, but there are providers that deal with working out, what your tax liabilities are and actually filing taxes at the various county and state tax offices as well. So being really clear on where you want to expose yourself from a tax perspective is really important, which is why I guess when we think about can we service this business from Australia, which, if you're in software or anything that's through remote delivery, those are one of those examples where I'm like, well, what is your need to actually incorporate? Is it because you want people on the ground, because you want local sales reps? Well, there's, ways you can go about that, which we'll touch on later around having those people engaged without having to employ them and all the kind of headache that comes with that as well.
Yeah, you touch on a really good point about, in sales tax, the complexity because of the different states having, different rules and also different thresholds on, sales tax. We've had, clients that don't realize that some states are consumer based. So if you have consumers in different states using your products or using your services, then those consumers in those states, you may need to pay sales tax if you've reached a certain threshold. We've had a client, actually one client comes to mind who was actually selling his Australian company, but all of his consumers were in the US. So he had never paid sales tax, and that company had never obtained any advice in the US. But because they're on the market in the US, they had triggered off various sales tax thresholds, and he was going through due diligence, and this is one of the questions that was asked. And unfortunately, this was a huge deal for the buyer, was have you complied with all your sales tax or taxes in the US? And he couldn't answer this because he didn't know, he didn't seek advice on it, and he'd been operating in the US not knowing he had these various obligations and compliance. So it's really important that when you're thinking about moving into the US or any jurisdiction, that's not Australia, you are getting, obviously, even Australia, you should be knowing your obligations here, but really important you know your obligations in the US, what those tax compliances are, and following them, getting the right advice, because you may have this question arise, when you're trying to sell your startup and you don't know the answer, or your buyer's not interested anymore because now you have a bunch of tax that's due or penalties. This kind of touches into, you're talking about some of the regulatory complexities in some of the states. Now, if some of our people that are on the call today, they're thinking about moving to the US, could you talk about some of the, I guess, the key legal regulatory considerations they should be thinking about when moving into the US?
Yeah, so again, it comes back to that point of, the interaction of the federal sort of law and state law. As a general rule, federal law sort of will regulate what they call interstate commerce. So that's things that the federal government has sort of deemed to be, it's either commercial transactions happening across state borders, or that might impact the entire sort of nation. So things that they've sort of, key things that jump to mind are, in terms of privacy, they don't have sort of a cohesive privacy framework, but they do have some protections around, if you're working, if you have websites or online platforms that maybe work with children, sort of under the age of 13, there's a whole privacy framework for that. If you're dealing with health service providers in hospitals, you're dealing with health information, there's a whole framework for that. So there's sort of kind of industry specific, federal legislation in the privacy space. At a state level, that's where all kind of the meaty stuff is happening, sort of what you'd be familiar with from an Australian or context. In terms of, I guess, things that come up and will impact every business. So you've got things like the Federal Trade Commission. So they're the ones that regulate things like misleading, deceptive conduct, how you advertise, what you put out to the market. It's kind of the main consumer protection agency. But then each state also has its own consumer protection approach and consumer protection framework. So that's something to be aware of. One that comes up quite often is consumer product safety. So if you're dealing with products, we've got the Consumer Product Safety Commission in the US that will look at it from a federal level. They'll enforce the kind of nationwide mandatory standards. And then some states do have their own sort of product safety laws as well. So California is a great example. They have Proposition 65, which is sort of their heavy metals and, sort of testing requirements. And you might, I don't know if you've ever been to California, anyone on this call, but if you do, sometimes you'll go around and you'll see signs saying things like, this car park has chemicals known to the state of California to cause birth defects and things like that. And those sort of warnings are sort of mandated by that legislation. So I've seen businesses that go, yep, cool, I've ticked off all the federal requirements, and then get hit at a state level because they haven't considered that interaction. I think it's also a bit of a nuance that we don't come across so much in Australia. I think in Australia, we're pretty lucky that if something's regulated at a federal level, it's sometimes, but not as a general rule, doubled up at a state level as well, which makes life a bit easier. So that's sort of, I guess, one of the main complications. And just because you might be fine in, say, California, doesn't mean you're necessarily good to go in New York, for example. So you kind of do need to understand what you're dealing with, what your industry you're in, and getting that advice at a state-based level, which is time consuming, and it does kind of depend on the sector that you're in. Some things are easy though. IP, at least, you can get a trademark with the US Patent and Trademark Office, and that will protect you across the entire market. You can't rely on anything you've got in Australia for the US, so it's really important too, especially because of the penalties that courts are likely to award for IP infringement in the US. Really clear that your IP isn't infringing on someone else's, that you have the right to use your brand, making sure that those things are locked down from the get-go, because that can be a kind of a make or break when you come to the US market.
I was just wondering, as you were talking about all that, does this mean you need to get a lawyer or advisor in every single state?
Not it depends. That's a bit of a lawyer response. If we talk employment, for example, which we'll touch on after this, but if we take employment, employment law is largely state-based. There are federal minimum protections, but that's why I say, when I said earlier around being intentional around your expansion plans, that's kind of the reason why. So, if you're a business, you're thinking, wow, I'm going to have an office in every single state. Well, that's going to be very expensive to navigate and understand, which is why you'll see a lot of companies, they'll have headquarters or offices where they will say, well, we want all of our employees to be in maybe California and Florida and, I don't know, Arkansas. They'll pick 2 or 3 so that they can kind of keep things contained. From a compliance standpoint, they know, well, I only have to navigate employment law in 2 or 3 states. I'm not having to pay for lawyers everywhere. There are some things that, maybe you're in I guess one of the other benefits of the US is that there's a lot of lack of regulation too. So part of the issue is trying to identify, are you in a regulated or aren't you? And you can kind of look at your competitors and kind of guidance online to give you a bit of a sense check. It's if you're a financial services business, for example, you're probably going to have a much harder time than someone maybe offering a, general SaaS product. So it's sort of the same thing in Australia. We have things that are regulated, and if you don't know, you need to find out.
Yeah, no, great. Well, Jason, I mean, obviously you're in the market and you're in the US at the moment, and how has it been, from a regulatory perspective? What kind of challenges have you seen with Cake? And I guess what kind of tips can you give the audience? from your own experience?
Yeah, so some businesses are more heavily regulated than others, as we've touched on. So we're a software as a service business, and so we haven't had sales tax. We also haven't got an office yet. So even though we do have a few people, I think that's helped us to mitigate some regulation. We're going to talk about employment in a minute, so I'll sort of skip over that. So our goal has been to, as I said earlier, like to minimize, to be aware of, but minimize the upfront compliance cost, with a view to scaling that up as it become more substantial in the US. So so the first year was more about just finding out if it was even a venture that was worthwhile pursuing. And then over the last year that's become quite successful. We've been hiring and building a more established position. But so far it's been quite light from a regulatory perspective. We are monitoring the risk, so I would advocate people having a risk register and speaking with their lawyers and advisors and perhaps people like Austrade or whoever's helping with the US go to market, just to try and understand what the risks are, and then having a plan to sort of work through them over the right sort of time frame as part of your expansion. So that's sort of how we're largely tackling things.
Yeah, no, that's some really great tips. The risk register is a really great idea that I think, I guess, touches on planning, which Stephen was talking about right at the beginning, is understanding your why and then doing planning and working out which state you're actually going to move into.
Yeah,
Because
I think it's important part of like being a startup founder is you've got to be able to move fast and break things.
Yeah,
If you solve every single compliance issue on day one, then you're never going to go anywhere because you're going to spend all your time, on that. But at the same time, you do need to mitigate risk. Like you
yeah,
said, you don't want to take no steps and then get to a position where your company falls over because
yeah,
you've got so much, legal and compliance baggage. So it's
mm,
always, I think, as a founder, trying to understand the framework, have a clear plan, and be tackling the risks, in the right order with the right
yeah,
support.
yeah. So I mean, that's something you've been through, and you're a very busy founder, with new ventures as well, and with your new Taurus venture now. I guess it's for new founders that are on this presentation now. I guess, is there any tips that you can give them on how can they balance this? Because we do have clients that get thrown a bunch of legals and implications they have to consider, and at the same time they're trying to run a business. So yeah, any kind of quick kind of tips before we move on to the next point?
Yeah, I think, you need to be very good at problem solving. You need to be very good at understanding what to do first. You need
Mm,
to always keep the business moving at all costs, so you just need to be mindful. Is the business moving? If we're not moving fast enough, we're going to die. So there's no point, if we've got our legals done or not, isn't going to matter. So
yeah,
it's like,
yeah,
for me, you just need to have a hierarchy of priorities.
yeah,
Your growth and your team and your customer always come first.
yeah,
Without those things, you cannot succeed. But if you have too much risk, it's going to weigh you down. It's going to be on your mind, and it's going to
mm,
stop you thinking clearly. Having a risk register, having someone smart on your team to perhaps even hold that burden for you somewhat, especially like maybe not day zero, but like day one, day
yeah,
two, like starting to get somebody very serious on your team who can help you, and then having great support. I'm a big believer in having the right support network, and
yeah,
outsourcing things to experts, especially where they're very technical or they're very high risk. So,
yeah,
I'd suggest getting, talking to Stephen and getting the right help.
yeah. No, great, thank you. Um, well, I guess moving to the last topic we wanted to touch on really quickly before we wrap up is, we talked about employment and how that's going to work, and when you're looking at expanding. And one of the common question we get is, do I hire directly or do I use some other way? Because a lot of people that we come across use employer records as a way to, I guess, get around or mitigate their compliances in the US. What have you both seen? I mean, Stephen, maybe you start from the legal side, and Jason, if you could finish off with any practicals that you could share with the with the viewers.
Yeah, and there's a few great questions coming through for the Q&A as well, which I think this will tie back into when we sort of sort of get to that point in the presentation. But in terms of, I guess, weighing up the sort of relocating your existing staff or your founders versus hiring on the ground, there's obviously, the pros of relocating is taking that institutional knowledge that you already have about your business with you, but you're unfamiliar with the market. I've had clients who are in sort of maybe traditional sales businesses where they actually do need to rely on some guy from small town Alabama who's got all the connections in order to actually grow the business, and it's not some sort of hotshot from New York that can do that. So you kind of need to understand what are the dynamics in the particular states that you're dealing with. Each state is a law unto itself. They're all culturally actually very distinct, and so trying to apply a one-size-fits-all approach can be quite hard. So there's that benefit. Obviously, in terms of employer records and things like that, it's much simpler. It's administratively much easier to navigate. They're the ones responsible for, getting the employment contract right, for, the 401ks and, sort of all the kind of compliance things around, making tax payments to the IRS and things like that. So that can be a huge benefit. And I'm sure Jason can speak more to the sort of practical benefits, but that can be one of the main selling points from that perspective when you're just starting out, especially too, if you're thinking, well, I want all my people in New York, but I would really love to have one person in Colorado, so maybe I'll do an EOR for them. Sorry, I think they're doing office testing, alarm testing. But the other thing as well is just from a tax perspective. So one thing around, and we'll touch on this, there's some questions around, servicing the US market out of your Australian entity that we can talk about in Q&A, but using the EOR as a means to kind of prevent your Australian entity being drawn into the US tax net and having that layer of separation. Because once you start hiring directly, if you're hiring employees in the US out of your Australian company, then that will be kind of a high risk from a tax standpoint. I'll jump to Jason now while they're doing the little alarm testing in the background, so you don't have to hear that.
Yeah, look, I think you covered that quite well, Stephen. To reiterate a couple of things, and from our real life experience expanding Cake, we chose to rely on our core team and our core IP and do a lot of traveling in the beginning, just to learn the lay of the land. We felt like the agency cost would be too great and the financial cost would be too great. The conversion rate on a full-time US tech salary to the amount of money we had and were raising, and we're trying to make sure our unit economics were maintained throughout that period so that we were investable and scalable. So we're really just solving things from first principles. We only had so much money and we had a good team, and we're like, right, let's go do this. So we spent about 12 months doing that. And then we started hiring slowly into the areas where we were having success. So, sales, community partnerships, and customer success. So, that was a gradual process. States chart, the wages in states are very, very different. So don't just think that because someone in California costs 300,000 Aussie, that's the only, employer market over there. So we learned a lot. And then we hired after we'd learned a lot of lessons, and that was a really successful, the proof's in the pudding. So happy with that. But look, every company has its own path, so good luck to you on that. Now, from a hiring perspective, we already had an employer of record established. We work closely with a bunch of really good ones at Cake, from Deal and Remote, and then I'm sure there's others. Sorry, a few of the details escape me, but look, they are a very valuable service. I feel like they do kind of work to some degree, and then perhaps having your own entities and hiring and that whole process can sort of tip back towards doing it internally. But for us, because we have a global team, in Philippines and in Europe and the US and South America now, that's been really, really convenient for us. There are costs associated to that, but it's always like it's a trade-off. Is the EOR cost greater, or overall, what's the return on doing it yourself? So again, like I said before, it's a balance between moving really fast and keeping all the compliance up to date. So that's something that you'll need to weigh up. But Yeah, I've seen both work as well.
Mm,
We went the EOR route. I've seen other companies have entities and hire from day one from
mm.
founders that I really respect. So you'll have to probably make your own mind up based on your circumstance.
Yeah, no, that's a really great tip, and it is something that we see as a common question: is do we hire now or do we use an EOR, and the cost involved in having an EOR? And maybe that is, just the beginning. You start with an EOR and test the market, and you know, figure out whether you need to hire internally or not from there on. It's really great. Well, thank you so much, Jason. That was a really great, end to that. The Just moving to I guess, the takeaways now there as we get to the end. So some of the takeaways we wanted to, I guess, highlight from this presentation is, why are you expanding to the US? So we, as advisors, and Stephen and I have seen this quite a lot, is people that don't think about the why. So I think this is the first question, and a really good takeaway is, why are you doing this? Do you even need to do it? And then secondly, you know, I do a lot of work in the US kind of flip up kind of scene, where I get a lot of clients that are wanting to flip their Australian company up into the US and think it's a super easy process. I really wanted to reiterate here that it's not an easy or stress-free process, particularly if you have a lot of shareholders on your cap table. It does take time to get that flip undergoing. And the third point is modeling. So planning, as Jason talked about, is planning and putting together risk registers, or planning and structuring, thinking about everything before you start taking a step. But obviously, as a startup, you want to be moving fast as well. So thinking about your expansion plan and modeling through what it's going to look like. The associated setup cost when you're moving into the US. What does it mean from a tax perspective, the setup, and then obviously your ongoing cost. What does that mean for the business? Can you sustain it? Or is it going to be too much where the business falls apart anyway? And then lastly, understanding, the regulatory framework that you're actually going into in the US, which state are you venturing into, which industry you're operating into, and getting the right advice in each of those states. And then obviously the compliance costs and burdens you might have to face as you move into the US at the beginning, but also ongoing. So it ties back into the modeling point. So that's the key takeaways. I really appreciate you guys all being on this panel with us. It's been really amazing. So thank you.
Cool. So that's the main part of the webinar. I'm just going to, before we jump into Q&A, and I'll give you a few more moments just to put some final questions through. We've got a heap. I'm going to do my best to try and consolidate. There's a couple of sort of crossovers, so I'll do my best to sort of consolidate where I can. But while we're just letting you do that, we've got this fact sheet on understanding business structures in the US, sort of sets out the kind of pros and cons and the different factors for each structure type that we commonly see in the US market. So welcome to download that. Also, I think a copy will be emailed potentially as well. We've got our next webinar too. So, I guess this is the opposite to expansion. So if you're planning your exit from the business for a startup and you're thinking about next stages, really good to sort of be thinking ahead of those things and plan for the future. So we've got a webinar on the 13th of March about that. So highly recommend you attend that one. Before we jump into questions, I'm just going to let you know about LegalVision's membership. So LegalVision offers a membership where your business can get unlimited access to our full team of over 100 specialist lawyers for all your business's usual legal needs. So if that's your commercial and regulatory, which sort of sits with me, things like tax, which Helen supports on, and a whole raft of other things as well. So our team sort of assists with document drafting and reviews, unlimited legal advice consultations, as well as domestic trademark registration, international trademark registration, and much more. You don't have to worry about the cost of sort of lawyers on a fixed fee or hourly rate basis. We have an all-inclusive membership. So for a fraction of sort of a weekly fee, it's kind of like having your own in-house lawyer to take care of all of that legal work that your business comes up. So that allows you to focus on sort of the strategic things like, why am I moving to the US and how am I going to get there? So if you want to learn more about that, you can claim your complimentary consultation. Feel free to just put your details in the survey at the end of the webinar. Cool. So Q&A. Now, we've had a couple of questions around the point that we sort of, I think, raised earlier in the presentation around servicing the US market out of your Australian entity or your Australian operations. And I think that's a really important one, because that kind of is one of the biggest areas that I think people don't understand, and which is why there's this desire maybe to, flip up or, incorporate in the US, because that's the only option that people know about and can see. So I guess, and maybe this is a question to start with for you, Helen, is what are the sort of things or the examples that you've seen before where, potentially a client could have just serviced, their business out of Australia? And what are the things that people need to think about around some of the, maybe the tax implications, if they're thinking about servicing out of Australia, but they want to move to the US, for example, and how would that sort of work? And there's some other bits. Start with that.
Yeah. So it's a very common question. And when you're thinking about just servicing US consumers, but staying in Australia, it's a very good start because it means your compliance costs are low. And the way we would generally suggest it, I mean, obviously every business is different, but is setting up a US subsidiary and having that owned by your Australian company. In most cases, a lot of the clients we work with do have a group structure or corporate structure here in Australia. And if you have a head company in Australia, then that subsidiary would be wholly owned by your head company. There are benefits from a tax perspective when you're, bringing money back into Australia, when you're repatriating, dividends from the US into Australia. But for a lot of clients, there's actually no profits to actually distribute back in. What we generally see is, how do we actually get money into the US to actually start that subsidiary? So, a lot of cases, we see that as being in the form of a loan or some sort of services arrangement where, the Australian head company might be providing services to your sub because all your employees are here. And I think that was one of the questions is, can you use your existing Australian employees to provide services to your US sub? And you can, but you need to ensure that you're putting in place the appropriate and correct documentation from a legal perspective to evidence that relationship, and such relationship is at arm's length. And so this is where we touch into transfer pricing territory, where we have to ensure the price that's being paid between the two jurisdictions is at a arm's length price to not trigger off the transfer pricing implications. And essentially what that means is each jurisdiction is getting the appropriate profits and being taxed appropriately, so that money or services or even IP are not being moved from one country to another for nothing. So it's really important you're getting the right advice there and putting in place the right documentation, and then thinking about the cost to actually fund the US entity. What was the second question, Stephen? Sorry.
Oh no, the other thing I just want to add to that too is, there are still situations where a US subsidiary isn't actually required. I think we see this a lot, don't we, Helen, in software, for example, where you have an Australian company, it's Australian founded. The founders have no desire to actually move to the US. They want to stay in Australia.
Yeah.
And all they're doing is basically selling their software to US-based customers. And
That's
in those
right.
situations, I think where we've sort of landed is, well, if you're not needing many, if you don't have this desire to set up a big office with lots of, developers or marketers or anything like that, why would you bother setting up a US subsidiary? And do you want to maybe speak to that and why that is beneficial than, say, setting up a US company, but effectively controlling from Australia and the issues that can come with that anyway?
Yeah. So that is a really great point, because a lot of clients don't actually need to set up in the US. And so we would use your Australian entity. You have to think about, when you're using your Australian entity, are you then creating a permanent establishment in the US? And that essentially means, are you now becoming essentially a taxpayer in the US? Do you need to then remit tax in the US? And that would only be if you meet the definition of a permanent establishment, and that is you have a business there, you've established an office, and you have employees, and you have a presence in the US. And that is when you need to start thinking about, okay, what taxes do we need to pay? That does add, extra cost, an extra layer of complexity, because you'll need to lodge a tax return via your Australian entity that you need to think about. But it is a really great way, if you're not sure whether you want to actually go into the US market and you just want to test the market, is you could just establish, a presence in the US, pay the tax, and then think about how you want to structure as a starting point, rather than going through spending a bunch of money, setting up an entity over in the US, dealing with transfer pricing, and paying a bunch of money unnecessarily when you might not have a consumer base there. You also asked, before about if you set up in Australia, you're moving into the US market with your Australian entity, but then you decide to move over there. Something that a lot of founders don't realize is when you, as a founder, actually cease residency here in Australia and you're actually moving to the US, is you can also trigger a taxing event. So it's a CGT event when you cease your residency in Australia and you establish residency in another jurisdiction. And that can be an issue if, let's say, you as a founder, you own shares in your company, which is now very valuable. At the point of when you cease residency, you're now having to be, you're triggering off a taxing event, you're now subject to tax, even though you haven't sold anything and you haven't actually made a profit. So it's really important when you're thinking about moving to the US and changing your residency from a personal perspective, that you're getting the right advice and not doing something that could result in, tax that you didn't really think about.
Cool. And I'll just add to that, and then I've got a question for Jason. But there was a question as well around, what are benefits for US clients maybe dealing with a US sub versus, say, an Australian company, for example. So if you're in that situation where you go, well, my business doesn't actually need, I don't want to have employees there, or maybe I only want one or two and I can use an employer of record to solve that issue. And I just want to deal with my business, remotely via Australia. You can still, you can enter into contracts with US entities. You can have your contracts localized for the US market. There is obviously the legal risk that your Australian entity, for example, then might be subject to US laws in terms of, if there was a contract dispute, maybe that would be heard in a US court, which can be more expensive, but usually you try and deal with that in the contract anyway. So making sure your contract is clear on those cross-border issues can kind of help mitigate that. You may encounter some businesses or some sectors where they just, it's how they've always done it. They want to deal with a US company because, that's their preference. That happens in every market. It's not there's not necessarily a legal obligation to only deal with US companies unless, you're in a sanctions jurisdiction, or maybe the services you're providing do require you to be incorporated locally and to be appropriately licensed, say, some sort of professional services or financial services capacity. The question that I thought might be useful good for you to touch on, Jason, there were sort of two of them. So one of them was sort of, what were if you had sort of your top three considerations for preparing to enter the US, but also, I guess, based on your experience and what you've sort of seen, how would you, I guess, if you could go back in time, what would you have done differently to test out the US market? I know you were sort of kind of pulled into there for kind of more corporate reasons, but is there anything that you can share, like sort of shed light on based on your learnings?
From a legal risk perspective, or just in general?
From a business operation, or whatever you like.
Yeah, so like things I would do differently. The first time we expanded internationally, I think, we were a bit naive and we weren't as methodical as we could be. So I think a great principle for startups in general, business in general is having a hypothesis and testing it, as quickly and efficiently as possible. So yeah, so I think that would be one way. Look, a lot of what we've done has gone well. One challenge we had was because we're a small team and I was doing a lot of the, boots on the ground work. It was challenging to be able to connect into, all the people that really needed to be involved. So for example, you do an Austrade program and you learn so much, but then integrating that knowledge into the team was a challenge. So perhaps, finding a way to bring more of the team with you, through that early stage, would be another thing I would try and do better. I don't know how exactly I would do that, but I think, it's really important to do the expansion as a team. There's so much to learn. And yeah, so those would be a couple of the big ones anyway.
Cool.
I don't want to take up too much time though. There's so many great questions here.
Yeah.
I just feel like we need like a little approach where we just like go bang, 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 bang and try and tick as many of these off as we can.
So I've had there's a couple of questions around LLCs and corporations. And I guess just to reiterate, so the, decision to use an LLC or a corporation is kind of driven by those external factors. So if you're thinking investment, if you're thinking stock options, having shareholders, things like that, you probably can only go down the C Corp route. You can't really achieve those things with an LLC. When there's some questions around costs involved with those sort of things and lead times, it really depends. Different states have different processing times, different states have different ongoing compliance requirements. So the setup fee might be quite high, but in one state it might be lower in another. But then in some states you might need to have a registered agent that does all your annual returns and things like that, which is another cost. And there's obviously all the filings involved. So it's kind of hard to accurately, I think there are websites that summarize all the different ongoing costs online, which might be a useful reference. One of the things, and I think this is maybe, relevant to what you sort of encountered, Jason, was around, if you are just moving to the US purely for those capital raising purposes, because, VCs only want to invest in C Corps, how, I guess, that's kind of that's really kind of a corporate call, right? It's sort of a, at what point, what are the things that people should really kind of think about when they're making that decision? I think you mentioned earlier, you wouldn't do it for a small $25,000 sort of funding, but what are the sort of other things maybe that people need to turn their minds to if they're thinking, okay, I'm going to flip up or I'm going to set up in the US purely to take on VC funding?
So the key for me is that you're going to market there. There's two moments you can do that. It's before you go there at all. Like there's always the two phases with zero revenue and zero work done, and you're selling the dream. So you can sort of raise then, but that would require, I'm moving to the US. We're totally committed to the US. We think we can get US customers for this reason. So it's like really well thought out plan, and we're going, and we need funding to go. And then the other one would be, we've been here now for 12 to 24 months, and we have data and we have a revenue, and we understand, this is more like the growth story. We need funding now to grow in the US. We're already committed, you know what I mean? And here's how we're committed. Here's how our team is connected. Here's how we're going to acquire customers. So for me, it's, raising in the US is very much about going to market in the US. And I would say that about any region from my experience. And there are outliers, of course, but, I think just jumping on a plane and cruising around San Francisco trying to get money when, you're going to market in Australia for the next 2 years, I think is not, that's not the right way to do it. It's really US investors for US business.
Well, there's also a few questions coming through asking about Canada. I think one of the things there I'll just touch on there very briefly is, I guess Canada is proximate to the US, but some of the cross-border issues that Helen has touched on earlier around transfer pricing, tax residency, those things are still, they're still going to be relevant whether you're thinking of a US sub or a Canadian-based sub. Maybe the tax system itself in Canada, I know nothing about Canada, might be easier, so there may be some benefits there. But one of the key things again is, if you are setting up a company in another jurisdiction, but you're sort of pulling the strings from, say, Australia, there's going to be cross-border tax issues to manage, and vice versa. If you just have your Australian company and you move to Canada or you move to the US, you're potentially dragging your Australian company into the tax net of those jurisdictions. So no matter where you're sort of thinking, in the world, some of these principles are actually sort of universal around, how do I move funds from an Australian company to a foreign company, and things like that. So yeah, I think tax advice is usually the starting point for these sort of expansion plans as well.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time, and I think we've got to wrap up at 12. We don't want to hold you on for any longer. Obviously, we've had a ton of questions come through, which is great. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get through them all. I want to remind you that you do have that complimentary consultation if you want to learn more about LegalVision. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. This is a free webinar. We value your feedback. So please, we'd love you to complete the 30-second survey at the end. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you at our next presentation.
And I want to thank Jason as well for sharing his practical experience. I really appreciated him being on here.
No, thanks for having me and all you do to support startups. Big fans. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason. Thanks.